Good afternoon. We are glad that you're here. My name is Ken Holden, and I'm the Executive Director of the Marshall Center for Christian Ministry here at Georgetown College. And it is my privilege and honor to welcome you to this 2020 edition of the George Walker Reading Endowed Lecture. Before I forget, it's always good just to say if you have your cell phone with you, you might want to put it on silent, just for the sake of our speaker as well as embarrassment. It does happen. Our lecture is named for Dr. George Walker Reading, a Georgetown College graduate and member of the faculty of Georgetown College for 30 years. In addition to the information that's printed on your program, I would add that following his 30 years as a professor on this campus, Dr. Reading taught for 8 years at Boyce Bible School in Louisville, Kentucky. He and his wife, Carolyn, then lived and served for 2 years at Oneida Baptist Institute in Oneida, Kentucky, Clay County. And then in 1984, he became chairman of the religion department of Mid-Continent Baptist Bible College in Mayfield, Kentucky. George Reading passed away on January 28, 1989. George and Carolyn Reading had 3 children. Lucy Pat Reading, who married Bill Curl, and they served together for many years as international missionaries. The Curls now live in Orlando, Florida. Dr. Rogers Reading, who lives in Bessemer, Alabama with his wife Shirley, and David Reading, who lives in Columbia, South Carolina. Lucy Pat Curl and David Reading are both Georgetown College alums. The Reading Lecture is a co-sponsored event between the Marshall Center and our Georgetown College Religion Department. And I certainly want to acknowledge and thank Dr. Sheila Klopfer, the Religion Department Chair, for just working with me and setting this up and much more that goes along with this for Dr. Newman this week. Thanks to Dr. Terry Clark, Dr. Jeff Asher, Dr. Brian Langlands, and other adjunct religion department professors who might be here. I'd also like to acknowledge Cynthia Insko, Reverend Insko, where are you? She's here, there you are. Yeah. A member of the board of the Marshall Center, Board of Directors. Are there any other board members here? I know a couple said they might be able to come. And thanks to HK and to Daniel Fleener for pictures and for video. The Reading Lectures are presented with the goal of inspiring the spirit, challenging and expanding the mind, and encouraging further study and involvement. And we trust that such a worthy goal is accomplished by providing an annual lecture that brings to our campus some of the best known and most widely published Christian scholars in the United States and from around the world. So with that being said, would you join me in prayer? Holy, gracious, and loving God, we are thankful. Thankful for the gift of this day, for the gift of life itself. Thankful, too, for minds that can learn and discern and be stretched with new ideas and perspectives. Thankful for Georgetown College, its past, its present, and its potential-filled future. Thankful for its great cloud of witnesses who include George and Carolyn Reading. Today, God, turn our thankfulness into a holy thirst for a fresh word, a new thought, a heretofore unimagined idea. We pray, therefore, that even now you will bless and guide our guest and friend, Beth Newman, as she offers us refreshment this afternoon. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Ken? Beth Newman is a dear friend of mine. I've known her for nearly 10 years and have grown to deeply appreciate her scholarship and her work. She's the kind of person who is both incredibly brilliant and delightfully personable, as you're going to see today. Beth has published books on Christian hospitality, Teresa of Avila, the 16th century Spanish mystic, And her most recent book, Divine Abundance, Leisure, the Basis of Academic Culture, is the topic of today's lecture. It's also available at a discounted price. There are brochures there on the back table. She's brought that as a gift. So if you want to pick up one of those brochures, there's the discount language on there, and you can order it online. Beth has taught theology and ethics at such prestigious institutions as St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, the Baptist Theological Seminary of Richmond, and Duke Divinity for many years, influencing a countless number of pastors, ministers, and students who have gone on to have, I think, meaningful kingdom impact on the church and the world. One of the reasons that I admire her is that she's the kind of Baptist that cares deeply for the church universal. She's a delegate to the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity and has conversations and dialogue with Catholic brothers and sisters. And on top of all that, she serves her local church as a pianist, a youth leader, children's VBS director. I'm thrilled that she's agreed to come today and present the 2020 Reading Lecture. After her lecture, we hope to have a short question and answer time. So if you would pull out one of these pins, and on the back of your bulletin you can write down questions that at the end I'm going to invite you to ask our lecturer until we run out of time. So if you would, please welcome Elizabeth Newman to the podium.
Well, it's certainly an honor for me to be here at Georgetown College and to be invited to give the Reading Lecture, so I thank you for that. And I've had really wonderful visits so far with your students and also with excellent faculty, so what a treat. Okay, so for my lecture, I'm going to start out by giving a sort of broad theological understanding of leisure. And then I'm going to turn and look at leisure in terms of the classroom and our daily lives, so more practical. Okay, what images come to mind when you hear the word leisure? Rest, relaxation, walking on a beautiful beach at sunset. Perhaps you think of other fun activities, biking, fly fishing, like Dr. Asher and Dr. Clark. I just had conversations with them, so I had to throw that in. When we think of leisure today, we typically think of it as a break from the rigors of study and of hard work. Leisure is freedom from all the demands on our time. It refreshes us so we can return to work and then become more productive. So here I have a very complicated diagram where you have leisure in one sphere and work in the other. And this is our typical understanding. To imagine leisure as an escape, however, is a mistake. Indeed, I want to argue that such an understanding of leisure is a distortion of true leisure. One could even say it is a heretical understanding. That is, it is embedded in a distorted theology. The philosopher Joseph Pieper, in his classical book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, makes this astonishing claim. No one who looks to leisure simply to restore his or her working powers will ever discover the fruit of leisure. So no one who looks to leisure simply to restore his or her working powers will ever discover the fruit of leisure. Before I engage Pieper more fully, we can begin to see this understanding already embedded in language. So Greek skole, Latin schola, which is our word for school, and it is derived from the word that means leisure. This word means leisure. So you might find that hard to believe, that school and leisure mean the same thing, okay? But to develop, for Pieper to develop his understanding, he turns to a vice which he sees as the besetting sin of modernity. And this vice is sloth, or ascetia, Greek for sloth. So when we think of a sloth, we might think of the animal, lazy, lounging around. But despite these beliefs to the contrary, Pieper denies that sloth is the same thing as laziness. Rather, he argues, laziness is a symptom of sloth. But an equally, if not more prevalent symptom, especially in the academy and perhaps our dominant culture, is constant busyness. Thus, the workaholic and the indolent are alike incapable of true leisure. This is because sloth, whether manifest as busyness or laziness, is a despairing refusal to be oneself. And there, Pieper's citing Søren Kierkegaard. It's a refusal to be who one is before God. Quote, a person's happy, this from Pieper, a person's happy, sloth, Pieper describes sloth as the opposite of a person's happy and cheerful affirmation of their own being, their acquiescence in the world and in God, which is to say, love. Then both the constantly busy person and the habitually lazy person are unable to receive their self as a gift, ultimately from God. Sloth then causes one to lag behind the self that God creates it to be. Okay, so then, where do we go? Rightly understood then, I'm still with Pieper, leisure requires, quote, a receptive attitude, a contemplative attitude. It is not only the occasion, but also the capacity for steeping oneself in the whole of creation. Leisure thus leads one to see and accept what Pieper calls the reality of creation. But what does it mean to see and accept the reality of creation? Pieper cites Thomas Aquinas' commentary on Proverbs 8. This is Proverbs 8. And, there's a figure of wisdom, representative of divine wisdom. So here's wisdom talking. Then I was beside him, God, like a master worker, and I was daily in God's delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in God's inhabited world and delighting in the human race. Aquinas, commenting on this, says that we see here how divine wisdom is, quote, always at play, playing throughout the whole world, unquote. So in other words, the world, on this understanding, is not simply a neutral entity. Divine wisdom, rather, always delights and is rejoicing in the world. To accept the reality of creation, then, is to see that intrinsic to all being is a communion with a divine wisdom, not our own. Okay, so intrinsic. You can't have being without also having that divine wisdom intrinsic to it. Today, however, when we hear the word wisdom, we tend to think of words perhaps like learned or smart. Yet, as T.S. Eliot rightly asked, in sympathy with where Pieper's going, where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? Unquote. So wisdom is more than the accumulation of knowledge. If divine wisdom is indeed a cosmic reality, then human wisdom is always a participation in a wisdom greater than ourselves. Leisure as openness to divine wisdom thus pertains to all knowing, to all spheres of life, the whole world, as Proverbs indicates. I think excuse me, I thought I had that in there. Okay, never mind. Okay, we'll come back to that. So understood, leisure provides a way to discover how various disciplines and various knowledges are a part of a divine abundance. Leisure is not then something one does in order to be more productive, a view sustained by utilitarian calculus. Rather, true leisure casts light on the purpose of work, or the purpose of education. This purpose is a participation in divine wisdom, known most fully in Christ, as we read in 1 Corinthians 1:24, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Rightly understood, leisure is both contemplative and active. Leisure is a contemplative reception of knowing as gift. At the same time, leisure is actively becoming the kind of person capable of extending that wisdom to God and to other people. Or extending that wisdom and love, I meant to say, to others. Okay, objections. Before turning specifically to leisure in the classroom and in our daily lives, I want to engage some possible objections. First, the concern that leisure, while important, does not really belong in the classroom. We might want it, right, sometimes when our professors are going out there. But okay, that's the other kind of leisure. It sounds like it's prayer or worship, and indeed, worship ultimately is the spring of true leisure. But these activities, one might object, belong in the extracurricular sphere of the institution. Leisure, as I'm describing it, sounds like one is mixing up faith and knowledge. A second and related concern has to do with those who do not accept the theological convictions that undergird leisure as I've described it. Should one impose these in a classroom or other public setting? The reality, however, is that institutions are always embedded in and sustained by some kind of faith. The key question is not then, well, where does faith belong? But rather, which faith is in fact already guiding an institution? The faith that dominates the academic landscape today, as well as in many places of our dominant culture, owes a debt to Gnosticism. At least three key Gnostic convictions are antithetical to true leisure. First, for Gnosticism, being is not intrinsically good. The world is not created by a good God. As Irenaeus, 2nd century theologian, says, for Gnosticism, created being does not, quote, depend for its existence on God's power and art and wisdom, unquote. Secondly, Gnosticism places spirituality in a sphere separate from the material order. A Gnostic spirituality or a Gnostic leisure seeks to escape the dreary world in which it is trapped. Finally, Gnosticism is a thoroughly rationalistic movement. What I mean by this is that salvific gnosis has to do with the mind rather than with the whole of created being, rather with all the material world. It has its gnosis, it's simply in the mind. Consequently, a Gnostic may be an ascetic or libertine. You can do what you want with your body, because what counts is the mental spirit within. Gnosticism thus survives and even promotes an unending plurality of values. Gnosticism has no resources to see the material world as a place of communion. This is a world where, as the great Baptist theologian Walter Rauschenbusch has stated, quote, even the common thorn bush is aflame with the glory of God, unquote. To return to the earlier objection, an understanding of being as communion, in contrast to a Gnostic understanding, actually allows for greater freedom in relation to those of different faiths. This is because freedom is not a flight from the world, nor primarily located in individual choice. It is about becoming the kind of person and institution one is created and called to be. To live into the wisdom of being as communion is to see the other, as well as oneself, as gift, as participants in God's own giving and receiving. Diversity, from this perspective, is not relativism. It is rather a reception and a participation in the love and wisdom of God. Irenaeus, to go back to him, describes this as a great symphony. Created things in their great number and diversity fit beautifully and harmoniously into creation as a whole. The same artist was responsible for the wisdom, justice, goodness, and munificence of the whole work. In a similar way, Karl Barth uses the word polyphony to describe creation. Polyphony refers to the playing of many sounds or notes. I'm sure you musicians out there already know this, but it's done in a way that harmonizes them into a single unity. For Karl Barth, the internal communion between God and all of creation is the melody that frees creation to be itself, a grand symphony of praise to God. What makes the different sources and knowledges harmonious is that they are, in the final analysis, evoked by God. So going back to the language of gift, in the final analysis, they are gifts from God, because God desires to be known within God's creation. This is not to deny that there is going to be conflict and discord, but leisure as openness to divine wisdom enables a community, a college, or university to seek a polyphonous harmony rather than rest in discordant tunes. Okay, second part of my lecture. What makes the leisure I'm describing possible? What makes it possible not only in the classroom, but what makes it also possible, as I'm also thinking about the classroom, in our daily lives? So let me start by saying we can say about leisure and the classroom and the practices what Alistair McIntyre has already said about ethics. The first question is not, what am I to do? One can only answer this when one has answered the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part? Okay, so it's not just carving out time and trying to jump onto the leisure bandwagon, but it's asking the broader question of what story or stories do I find myself a part? What story or stories do I want to be formed by and to live into? Okay, and what follows then, I want to look at how three particular virtues sustain the story of leisure and of being as communion in the classroom as well as in our daily lives. Okay, so first is the virtue of paying attention. And I have here a quote from the American poet John Ciardi that states, "We are what we do with our attention." I used to constantly remind my son that when he played his video games. It's not like all of you are. So academic institutions, as I have indicated, easily justify their existence against the bar of usefulness. And this is sort of endemic in our culture. For all the lip service paid to diverse values and the encouraging of critical thinking, the modern academy easily pays lip service, or easily serves one purpose: to prepare the student to compete. This is true not merely for those who must publish or perish, it applies equally to those who must take part in the global economy as lawyers, MBAs, software engineers, etc. The philosopher Simone Weil, however, in her well-known essay, Reflections on the Right Use of School Studies with a View to the Love of God, argues against this utilitarianism by focusing on the habit of paying attention. Such attention, she says, is not about mustering willpower, contracting one's brows, holding one's breath, as one might do when a teacher says, "Pay attention," or a parent says that. So that's not what she has in mind. It is rather about learning to pay attention to the right things in the right way. And Weil focuses particularly on waiting. Paying attention, she says, is a kind of active waiting. As when one waits for the right word to come of itself at the end of a pen. Okay, so that's a little weird example, but she's trying to build her case here. And she emphasizes then that we do not obtain the most precious gifts by going in search of them, but by waiting for them. Such a countercultural statement, it's such a countercultural statement because we're all trained from a very young age, to take charge, to be independent, to be in control. So waiting could sound like wasting time. And we've all been there, right? When we had to wait, we're like, I'm wasting my time. But let me continue with they. They reverses a utilitarian approach to learning and to living. One does not study merely to secure an extrinsic goal. One studies to become a particular kind of person. Paying attention, even to failure, perhaps especially to failure, allows, they argues, for growth in humility. And they states this is a far more precious treasure than all academic progress. Okay? And she's focused on the kind of person you're becoming. It's not just about achieving. It's, are you becoming a certain kind of person? Or to know a geometry solution, Vey says, is as a precious gift, is to receive it as a sign of something greater, of living truth. So that might be hard to get your mind. I remember in my days in geometry, when my brother did better geometry than I did. I always wanted him to do it. But it's a sign of something greater. They thus can claim every school exercise thought of in this way is like a sacrament. Apart from this kind of attention, knowing will easily degenerate until the cosmos becomes dumb and blind, like a machine of which we are masters. Vey's understanding could seem ideal and irrelevant to the real world of work and competition. But what is the real world? Leisure is paying attention with a view to the love of God, a view to wisdom, enables learners to see more clearly the world as it really is. By contrast, as we noted, the vice that most opposes the virtue of paying attention, which is busyness, leads one to live in a fragmented and opaque world, a world that ceases to be transparent to the love of God, a world that ceases to be sacramental. Okay, a story that captures leisure, paying attention, and the reception of gift is Leo Tolstoy's short story. Got this here? I don't know if you're familiar with this. God sees the truth but waits. In this story, a Russian man by the name of Aksionov is found guilty of a murder he did not commit. So, I won't go into all that, but someone put something while he's in the inn where he is in his bag without him realizing it. So he's found guilty. For 26 years, Tolstoy writes, Aksionov lived as a convict in Siberia. His hair turned white as snow, and his beard grew long, thin, and gray. All that his myrrh went, he stooped, he walked slowly, spoke little, never laughed, but he often prayed. Unquote. He learned to make boots, earned a little money, and he bought a small book called The Lives of the Saints. Over the years, both the guards and the fellow prisoners came to admire Aksionov's meekness and wisdom. One day, the man who really committed the crime by bizarre circumstances ends up in the same prison. So here he is, face to face with the man who has been responsible for him having to spend 26 years in Siberia. As Aksionov thinks about all that he has lost, his wife, his children, his earlier life, he longs for vengeance, even if he himself should perish for it. Yet, in the end of the story, he says to his enemy, who is pleading for forgiveness, God will forgive you. Maybe I am 100 times worse than you. Puzzling response. And as Tolstoy writes, at these words, his heart grew light. Aksionov, through waiting and paying attention, becomes holy, forgives his enemy, and grows in love. Such transformation would have been impossible in a Gnostic version of the story, just to go back to my earlier point, since Gnosticism sees time as that from which we must escape, or that which we can do with as we please. Likewise, Aksionov could have spent his time in distraction, holding on to his own desire, especially for vengeance. But Aksionov embodies the statement, we do not obtain the most precious gifts by going in search of them, but by waiting for them. Perhaps you might think, well, he had no choice. He was in prison, right? you can't do anything but wait. But Aksionov more fully allowed himself to be drawn into God's time, a time in which he is gradually set free from his own sins, a time in which he is enabled to participate in God's love and truth. God sees the truth but waits, and so does Aksionov. Wei's understanding, beautifully displayed in the life of Aksionov, suggests that while we are called to seek wisdom, we are even more invited to wait for gifts we cannot yet fully anticipate. Right? None of us in this room can anticipate the gifts that we will receive in our lives. None of us. Such waiting, I'm saying that because such waiting entails an understanding of time as not only linear, time is more fully a participation in God who joins past, present, and future. In other words, God's creating and redeeming presence in all time enables a participation in divine wisdom wherever we are. Time, then, is not a neutral category, but an ontological and a theological one. And I'm saying this because it comes to my other point. There are always liturgies guiding our lives, right? It's not like there's a liturgy here and then we're not having, there are always liturgies, rhythms that are guiding our lives. And we can also say this about the classroom. There are always liturgies guiding the classroom, even if only implicitly. And a great book, James K. Smith has written about this when his book, Desiring the Kingdom. So he says the basic question is not whether or not liturgy, but which liturgy is forming us. So the question that I think we can ask in the classroom, but also in our daily lives, what kinds of liturgies might foster more fully the practice of leisure, the reception of wisdom? Wei's analysis suggests that fostering the habit of paying attention is crucial. How do we do this, especially when we are distracted? Paying attention, understood as waiting for a gift, might certainly include prayer, contemplation, but it might also be simply lingering before an image, before an object, before a text, and a kind of waiting. And that too would be leisure. I was recently heard a paper that a faculty member down at Baylor gave on slow reading. And she was talking about the academy, the academic text. And what does it mean to read slowly in the classroom? Because usually we're trying to just get through stuff. So those would be kinds of examples. These sorts of activities do not, of course, guarantee the habit of paying attention as waiting for a gift. But over time, I think that's the crucial thing. Over time, liturgies of leisure can, through both habit and grace, transform us in small and ordinary ways. Okay. So, second virtue I want to talk about is courage. Pieper states, this is one of my favorite quotations, this is a front of my book, "Wonder does not make one industrious, for to feel astonished is to be disturbed." Okay? So it's not to be astonished, it's to be disturbed. How does wonder disturb? One way is the realization that something is out of order, or that being as communion is broken. True leisure calls for courage, then, in the face of disorder and disordered ways of being. One story about leisure and courage is the film of Gods and Men. So, I don't know if y'all have seen this or not. But this is a French drama that centers on 9 Trappist monks who live with a largely Muslim population in Algeria. It's based on a true story. The film shows the monks in their daily modest activities, carrying food, cleaning floors, gathering honey to sell at the local market. They also tend to the sick in the village. They help procure visas for some. And most of all, they form friendships with their mostly Muslim community, neighbors. They pray, they sing the Psalms, they study St. Augustine and the Quran. As the Algerian Civil War in 1996 becomes more threatening, both the government and their families urge them to leave because they're in danger. The film depicts this intense struggle of the men in a situation that is becoming increasingly violent. The abbot tells the story about being with the village leaders and telling the leaders that the monks feel like they are birds on a branch, wondering whether or not they should fly off. And the leaders of the village respond, no, we are the birds, you are the branch. Okay, so that's how much they have entered into communion with their neighbors. And this is really a turning point. So as the monks continue to struggle with whether to stay or leave, they courageously continue their daily rhythm of caring for the land, keeping bees, praying together, eating together, attending to their neighbors. All of these are different kinds of leisure because they're all a participation in divine wisdom. These activities might not sound particularly courageous. Certainly in beekeeping, maybe that is courageous actually. My father's a beekeeper, so I grew up with bees. Okay. Certainly courage for each of these monks had already been displayed by their willingness to go to Algeria and to not be quote unquote normal, productive members of society. It is their daily leisure, both active and contemplative, with God and with their neighbor, that then leads them to a courage they did not know they possessed. It's not like they stepped into, said, we're going to be courageous. It's like they just eventually realized they were the kind of people who were called to remain in that situation. They are sadly eventually kidnapped and martyred. How does this dramatic tale relate to us and to the academy? Practicing leisure in the academy or in our daily lives requires courage precisely because it goes against the dominant emphasis on productivity, on you are what you do. As such, it might sound flaky from a certain perspective or navel-gazing, but it can take courage to stand still. As Milton says, they also serve who only stand and wait. And people can do that in very dire circumstances. The monks courageously stayed in their place. Their leisure might have easily looked to outsiders like foolishness in the face of growing tension and violence. One of the vices that opposes courage is foolhardiness. I'm like, you're being foolish. Why are you doing this? Why don't you leave? But it's in these ordinary acts of contemplation that the brothers who are habituated in the way they are do not allow themselves to be determined by fear. Their daily leisure enables them not to worship gods of productivity, competition, control. In the face of forces that would otherwise determine their lives, the brothers also know that their courage is ultimately a gift to them. Okay, the final, let me say a word here about this. One of the practices then I think that the monks embody that we could name is this ancient practice called statio. And statio is simply standing still. And it's the name, like, where we get the word station, because that's where things stop. So the practice is, for the monastics, statio was what they did before they prayed. They stopped and they stood still. In the Catholic tradition, walking the stations of the cross is a way that statio is practiced, because there you're before these images and you're standing still. But it can also be used in the classroom situation, is training in courage by just standing still, stopping one thing before doing another. And it's a very simple practice, but it is a way to train ourselves not to, in our own time of busyness, not to rush from one thing to another. And I think this can also be included in classroom teaching as well. Okay, last virtue then is hope. And let me put that up here. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Babette's feast in a minute. Leisure in the classroom, in our lives, in the academy more fully, requires the virtue of hope. Samuel Kimbrell, in his book Friendship as Sacred Knowing, develops an understanding of the self as porous, in contrast to the disengaged self, who believes he or she can only acquire knowledge through self-mastery. The porous self receives knowing as always a gift of communion with God and others. Underlying this, says Kimbrell, is the conviction that, quote, the deepest contours of reality are those defined by divine love, whether that be within God himself or as displayed in creation. So he's saying another version of what I said earlier. Okay, so in Dennyson's story, Babette's Feast, this can serve as a parable of leisure and hope in an otherwise diminished community. In this story, Babette, a famous Parisian chef, becomes a refugee after her husband and son are killed. Eventually, two poor Danish women allow Babette to live with them as their cook. The Danish women, they don't know she's a famous chef. Okay, she's just a refugee. The Danish women are part of a community, Denison writes, that have renounced the pleasures of this world, for the earth and all that it held to them was but a kind of illusion, and the true reality was the new Jerusalem toward which they were longing. So the community is sort of a Puritan understanding of being in the world. It's like you can't enjoy the beauty of the world. Despite this otherworldly focus, however, the community becomes caught in the memories of past injuries, quarrels, and destroyed friendships. 14 years pass. Babette comes into some money and decides to prepare a feast for her Puritan host. With her Danish host suspiciously looking on, because they think, what's she doing? She's wasting all this money. Babette spends weeks preparing a meal for the poor community. Despite their misgivings over Babette's apparent waste, the Puritans go along with her plan, deciding ahead of time that it would be improper to react positively to such extravagance. Their reluctant participation in Babette's grand meal, however, draws them into a world of grace and forgiveness. Grudges and resentments at this grand meal melt away, and in a final scene, they are singing and dancing under the night stars, united not only with each other, but also with all creation. Their supper, song, and dance in response to a divine love hitherto unknown is an act of both leisure and hope. This story, while about a small Danish community, nonetheless helps us imagine how leisure and hope can shape the classroom. One might have easily thought that the Danish community would never change. Their resentments too long in the blood, their focus on an otherworldly quasi-Gnosticism far too embedded in their lives. Yet in the end, divine abundance triumphs over scarcity. While a profound mystery, this transformation is made possible by Babette's loving introduction of another way of being in the world. she introduces, to go back to my word, a sacramental way of being, which Irenaeus would have embraced. The material world in all its complexity, frustration, blindness, and even apparent hopelessness is, even so, the world where Christ is. While different from the village of Denmark in many ways, the classroom too is an ordinary place. The virtue of hope reminds us that leisure is not secured by technique. Okay, I'm going to just skip a little bit here. Okay, so I want to talk about the virtue of hope then, as I finish up here, is different than optimism or pessimism. If Babette had been a pessimist, she would have not wasted time on the long preparation of the meal, but would have instead accepted their sort of pessimistic view of the world. On the other hand, neither is Babette optimistic in the sense of imagining that her efforts alone would change anything. She's simply offering a gift of love, trusting in the healing mystery. Her feast helps us see that those who practice leisure sustained by the virtue of hope can let go of having to control outcomes. Such hope enables us to move beyond discouragement or despair if our lives are not as we imagine they should be. Babette, after all, was a famous chef and left everything, had to leave everything behind. How does leisure and the virtue of hope relate to education? The practice of leisure tells us that education is, first of all, about becoming a certain kind of people and institution. Wisdom, as I said earlier, is not about simply the accumulation of knowledge, but more fully communion with God, others, and the cosmos. As St. Athanasius said, wisdom most fully in Christ has unfolded himself everywhere, above and below, and in the depths and in the breadth. Above in creation, below in the incarnation, in the depths, in hell, and breadth in the world. Because this global cosmic view, everything, he writes, is filled with the knowledge of God. Education as leisure, as a way of being, opens us to this cosmic wisdom. May we then have the patience, courage, and hope to practice this leisure, and in so doing enjoy, as the Danish village did, a divine abundance. Then, got some stars here, might we too have the wisdom to see the stars above as well as a common thorn bush, aflame with the glory of God. Thank you.
Right. We have time to receive some questions for Dr. Newman. Questions?
You use the whole created being, and I was wondering if that comes from where it says in the Bible, the whole heart, the whole soul, the whole mind, the whole spirit.
Yes, when you were talking about, yeah, they're related. I wasn't actually had that specifically in my mind, but I think that it certainly relates to my point that our knowing isn't just a kind of mental exercise, but it is something that received as a gift, but also, this is not to say we just get it drops from the sky, as also a habit and work for, but forms us. When we're seeking wisdom, it forms our heart, our soul, our mind. Yes, very good. Thank you. Yes.
What would you say in regards to, what would your words be to a person who was having difficulty trying to make connection between what they do for leisure, what they see as their leisure,
Right.
what they take, actual comfort, joy in, and consolidating that with their faith?
Yeah.
No, repeat that question.
Okay, well, let me see if I'm not going to be able to repeat exactly, but I think what I heard you asking was that what would I say to a person who is having trouble making connections with what they do for fun and then their faith, is that right?
Right, between leisure and between leisure and vocation in their faith.
Okay. So what's the connection between leisure, vocation, and faith? Well, leisure is grounded in an openness and a contemplation to God. And without that receptivity, it's going to be difficult for us to discover our vocation. And the vocation, of course, is a word that can mean, specifically, what I feel called to do here. But, vocation more broadly is about the kind of person or people God is calling us to become. And and I think just to wrap it back to the enjoyable activities, those are important. But what I'm trying to also argue is that to equate leisure with only doing these fun things, which we all want to do those, is to diminish this fuller understanding.
What would you say, how difficult would it be to change from a workaholic in school, in the classroom, just filling up your time all day, every day, going from that to having like the leisure that we're supposed to have? Right,
yeah. Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's one really that certainly I'm challenged by, but we all are, because we're brought up in that. You've got to do this, this, this. I think to not be overwhelmed, we have to sort of start in very small ways. So in our daily lives, are there places where, like the stage show, I can pause and before moving from one thing to another, sort of stop and remind myself that I don't own myself. How can I receive myself more fully as a gift? So I think there are those kinds of individual practices, but I would want to say there are also communal practices, both, and that was what I was trying. It's so counterintuitive in many ways for the way we're used to doing class time, but I know some folks in this room have helped me, actually, when I was teaching, think about liturgies so that at least I was having some space and coming in to allow some reflectivity, some contemplation, or some prayer. And and are there ways, within our community that we can do that as well? We all know too, we can just go to church and sometimes not be you're thinking about this. It's very hard to do, and it's in some ways normal, but so I think the ways of just, I think the first is just trying to focus on maybe small ways we can in our daily lives practice that.
What's the relationship between leisure and lament?
Ooh, that's a great question. Yeah. Well, I think, if we're constantly busy, or we're constantly distracted, or we're constantly angry, there is no space. You're doing all these other things. There is no space for true lament. Because I think, when the psalmists lament, that's really a way that they are, they are before, allowing themselves to be before God, and seeking, both, seeking to express where they are, and then looking ways to also be healed. I think. So so leisure is necessary, because you're not going to seek to lament to God if there's no space to sort of receive that. And I think then, though, that's a great question. I think also just thinking about wisdom, how do we bring that to bear on the things in our lives that distort our lives, and that can actually can even be destructive. And like Aksionov, my gosh, he had a right, if anyone did, to to give vengeance, and he has become the kind of person that doesn't do that, but is able to lament.
you say is the like joining point between like your personal leisure and leisure within like community and doing that with like the people around you?
Yeah.
Repeat the question.
Oh, yes, okay. What's the connection between sort of personal leisure and leisure with people around you?
And like particularly if like the people around you don't have the same type of leisure that you do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, I think there are, as I was trying to do with the classroom, there are ways to engage in that practice where it's not just my individual thing I'm flinging out there. You know, it's rooted in this tradition of leisure and a tradition of seeking for divine wisdom and waiting to receive that. And I think that is even something we can point out, present in a variety in other religious traditions as well. So I think there's room there to work for that. I think it's important personally to have time in daily when you are praying, on your own. Now the danger there is that can sometimes turn into it can sort of morph into it can easily morph into something like maybe obsession with yourself or something. So it does need to be grounded in the community. But I think there's got to be a balance between them, because really, we're in community right now, and part of learning divine wisdom is learning it through other people. The way I was describing it. So it's not just a Gnostic is going to say, I can just go to my mind and my own gnosis can get me there. But an understanding of creation as where divine wisdom is at play means that it is in play in the other person. And even the other person I think I might not need. It's still learning how to receive that as a gift. And that can be very difficult, but that's a goal, I would say.
We have time for maybe one more question.
Yeah, so I'm going to probably ask the same question in a couple of different ways, but it's
Okay.
relating back to embodiment and play as it relates to leisure.
Yes, good.
And so I'm kind of wondering, do disordered and disembodiment go together, kind of especially that Gnostic framework
Yes.
here, but then do leisure and embodiment go together? And so are embodiment and play kind of a way of living into this leisure? And that is a way of discovering the wisdom that already exists within our bodies.
Mhm.
And so the things I hear you talk about are very
Yeah.
embodied. So
Yes, yeah.
wisdom, this connection, this
Yeah,
courage,
yeah.
paying attention.
Yeah, that's a great question. Definitely, I would say leisure and embodiment are related. And the leisure I'm talking about is grounded in scripture, in theology. And that's why I think the sacraments become so important, because they are, and there are all sorts of ways one can think about that, but at least the way I was describing it in this talk is that the bread, at the table of Babette's feast and the wine become a means of grace that then heals the community. So it's just so important, I think, to be grounded. And part of leisure being embodied is leisure being embodied in the institutions, in academy. It's just not intended to just be stuffed over in this one area. And then your second question was about how it can help us think about our own bodies. Is that right?
Well, yeah, so I think about kind of like embodiment as a way of discovering like the wisdom that already exists within us.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think I'm a little hesitant there just because of, there's the Gnostic believes there's wisdom within, that you don't need sort of mediation. But I would say, the Legion, I would say, we do need mediation. So, like Augustine even, who has this very interior journey in the Confessions, right? He discovers that even his interior self is not his. God is there, right? So he's all this that he writes about. Even there, God is. So I think that's the kind of way I'd want to talk about that. But yes, very much though, to help people find stability in their embodiedness and see that as a place where the practice of leisure sort of opens up this world, that creation and ourselves as part of it.
Can we give a round of applause? As you're leaving, remember there are some brochures there on the right if you would like to get a copy of her book at a discount rate. Thank you for coming.